This week on Substance Stories, we're going to talk about the interplay between addiction and mental illness. Fergal, what do you know about the polyvagal theory?
Not much. No, I mean, the vagus nerve, the great wanderer, starts out in the brain and then basically goes to effectively everything except the pelvic organs.
So most of our nerves go down the spinal column from our brain, but there are 12 that don't. They're called the cranial nerves, and one of them is the vagus nerve, and it goes and innervates a little bit of our face, and it goes down into our heart, lungs, and guts.
Okay, now when neuroanatomists started studying nerves, especially the nerves that went from the brain to the body, they assumed that it was all a unidirectional pathway, whereby it was these nerves were structures that allowed the brain to tell the body what to do. Now we know, and certainly in the case of the vagus nerve, now we know that actually 80% of the traffic in the vagus nerve is actually the body sending signals back to the brain. And this is the bedrock, or this is the foundation of polyvagal theory. This idea that there is a brain-body connection and that behavior can actually influence mental state. That's the essence of polyvagal theory, but I'm sure you will fill in the details.
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting about that is when you say this. So we used to have this view very much that the mind was in the brain, and it was controlling everything. Well, now when we talk about the mind and our sense of self, we talk about the whole body, and we include different systems, not just the nervous system, but our hormones, our emotional state. In fact, often we actually talk about the self or the mind being in between us because of how important our relationships are in our life. But I guess the other interesting thing from my perspective about the polyvagal theory, which we're going to get in and break down in a sec, is that it's probably, to me, the second most important psychiatric theory ever come up with. The most important being attachment.
What's the most important psychiatric theory?
Attachment theory. For me, attachment theory is the most important psychiatric theory ever come up with. And polyvagal theory very much mimics the psychiatric theory, the attachment theory, where attachment theory was come up with by a man and then really expanded on by a woman. So a man Bowlby came up with the idea of attachment theory, but Mary Ainsworth really proved it and made it clinically viable. Well, Stephen Porges came up with the idea of the polyvagal theory, but Deb Dana really sort of made it clinically useful. And maybe I'll get in trouble from some men's rights activists about saying that, but that's my view. So what the polyvagal theory says is we have this, it says a lot of things, and it's about how our gut and heart and lungs are in communication with our brain, and our emotional states are really regulated through this theory, right? Through this system. And what we have is we have we have this window of emotional tolerance, right? Where it's down here, where anything where that lies within that window of emotional tolerance, we can manage. And then above that, we have our flight or flight response. So when we get so much arousal, so much stress that we get out of our window of emotional tolerance, we're in our flight or flight response. And then above that, we have our freeze response. And that is when we're so in stress and shock that we freeze up and we can't move. And people in traumatic episodes talk about that. Why do I mention the polyvagal theory? Well, I think the polyvagal theory is a fantastic way to talk about the interplay between mental illness and addiction. So the key thing to remember about the polyvagal theory is when we're in our window of tolerance, everything is A-okay. We can cope with any stressor we have. If I stub my toe, that is something I reckon I am firmly able to manage. It's within my window of tolerance. However, if I have a pre-existing mental illness, then I'm currently unwell with that mental illness, then my window of tolerance has been shrunk. And if I stub my toe, that might put me right outside my window of tolerance and more likely to engage in a behavior that instantaneously drops me within my window of tolerance. And that instantaneous drop into my window of tolerance, that is the addictive behavior. The problem is, even though it gets me back within my window of tolerance, over the long run, it actually gets me further outside my window of tolerance. And that, to me, is the interaction between mental illness and addiction on the whole. There are other things where people say that there are certain illicit drugs that are directly treating mental illnesses. For instance, the anxiolytic effects, so the anti-anxiety effects of alcohol might be treating someone's might be treating someone's anxiety disorder, but again, the next day they're going to have more anxiety because of the hangover effects and the withdrawal effects of alcohol. And again, it's the same pattern. I don't put too much credo in the in sort of self-treating. To me, I think everything is more readily explained using a polyvagal theory example of something pushing us outside our window of tolerance and us engaging in a behavior that immediately brings us down. And that, to me, is the interplay between mental illness and addiction.
What you've said, to me, can be explained by the psychological concept of the stress bucket and also the stress function curve or the Yerkes-Dodson curve. You don't need polyvagal theory to explain those phenomena. So how can you say that polyvagal theory is the most or the second most important psychological theory? What you basically said is we have a window of a tolerance. Well, that's the stress bucket theory. And then you've said that people use drugs sometimes to reduce their emotional arousal, which is the stress function curve.
So I think the thing is,
explain yourself, Dr. Bradley.
So your the Yerkes-Dodson curve is very similar to the polyvagal theory. I'll give you that, and your stress bucket.
Yeah, but the key difference between the Yerkes-Dodson curve and polyvagal is there's no mention of the relationship between the mind and the body in the Yerkes-Dodson.
Yeah,
curve.
so I guess what you're saying is,
it's
fill your bucket to the brim and it'll spill over sort of concepts. These are good, handy metaphors for mental illness. But I guess the polyvagal theory, like the attachment theory, is a sort of well evident scientific theory that is merging the psychological with the neurological, or in this case, the neurological endocrine.
Okay.
So I guess what I'm doing is I'm saying that this is a sort of, rather than a metaphor, this is what is occurring.
Okay.
In my mind.
So if this is not a metaphor, right? Let's look specifically at the metaphor that is the stress bucket, and specifically at vagal innervation and the interconnectivity between visceral organs and the brain. Where is the stress bucket?
So the stress bucket, so just because I think the stress bucket is the idea that we all have so much reserve, functional reserve, that we can cope with. So instead of using a window of tolerance, I've got a bucket and it's getting filled with stress. And then eventually, if it gets too stressed, it spills over and I can't cope. So I guess the metaphor there, and why it doesn't work, is stresses come in a wave. They don't fill our bucket it's not like a bucket that never goes away. But fine, we'll say that there's a hole in the bucket that's slowly leaking out the bottom. We can fix that.
Is the vagus nerve the hole in the bucket? Well, it might be. I think maybe I was being a bit too robust.
Overly complicated this. So I think that, to me, the interplay between mental illness and addiction is someone with a pre-existing mental illness is more likely to get an addiction because they've got a smaller window of emotional tolerance. And we can say that, we can use that same example for someone with a social disadvantage. We can use that same advantage for someone in a highly stressful situation in their life. That is the interplay between addiction and mental illness.
How does polyvagal theory allow someone to reduce their stress? Because what you're basically saying is that too much stress reduces our resilience and increases our risk of relapse for addiction.
We engage.
I actually agree with you on that. So
we engage in behaviours to try and, so imagine we've got a stress. For starters, so there's multiple things. If we want to grow our window of tolerance, there are many psychotherapies or somatic psychotherapies specifically aimed at increasing the mind-body connection and increasing our window of tolerance using sort of methods that would, meditative practices that are designed specifically to increase our window of tolerance, guided by polyvagal theory. The other thing is we can use method when we are outside our window of tolerance, when we are overwhelmed, we can use methods that are designed to, by what we've gained from the polyvagal theory, to bring us back within our window of tolerance. I'm thinking specifically breathing and meditative exercises. I'm thinking of temperature modulation, which I'm a big fan of. So tip skills out of DBT. This is the sort of stuff that I really think, that's why it's really great to have a great psychotherapist or a great counselor that helps you learn these sort of skills. But these skills are excellent. My favorite skill for when I'm feeling personally outside of my window of emotional tolerance is to jump to a freezing cold shower. That's very polyvagal theory influence and temperature modulation. Do you have a favorite skill to bring yourself back within your window of emotional tolerance?
I think that the physiological sigh, I think, is a great example of activating the vagus nerve, improving or increasing parasympathetic tone and thereby suppressing sympathetic tone. So I actually think that that is one of the best ways of doing. It's one of the best examples of the vagus nerve functioning as a reverse communicator between a body organ and the brain.
So
the physiological side depends on me
Fergal's saying. Sorry, Fergal. What just to get to what's saying is breathing out, and when we breathe out, we activate our parasympathetic system. So we activate that rest and relaxation, and we downplay that fight or flight. So it's he's like long breaths out, briefer breaths in. Sorry, just to explain what you're talking about, Fergal. Go on. Sorry.
Well, I thought I could explain it as well.
Well, you didn't, Sarge.
Well, I was going to. But the physiological side starts out with a large intake of breath, almost maximal, and then a second attempt at a almost supramaximal intake, followed by a prolonged exhale. Now, the thing here is that if you exhale more than you inhale, you then activate your parasympathetic nervous system via the vagus nerve, hence polyvagal. And that's in contradistinction to inhaling more than you exhale, which will activate the sympathetic nervous system. And sympathetic activation is what Wim Hof does with his hyperventilation techniques. So you can use your breathing to actually modify or modulate your autonomic nervous system and either tip it into relax, eat and sleep mode or flight and fight and fright mode.
And so that is our rough guide on the interplay between mental illness and addiction, and with a little bit of guide about how to treat it. There are lots of fantastic books and workbooks out there on polyvagal theory, but ultimately this stuff is better served when you've got a guide, a well-trained psychologist, counsellor, psychiatrist, GP, addiction specialist that can help you along the way. So if you are struggling with poor mental health, do reach out for help. If you are struggling with addiction, do reach out for help. Thank you very much for listening today. I hope it's been informative. Thank you very much, Fergal, for joining me.
Always a pleasure.